1 Kings chapter 3. We're going to go from verses 1 to 15. This section deals with Solomon asking for wisdom. Verse 1. Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. He brought her to the city of David until he finished building his palace in the temple of the Lord Yahweh and the wall around Jerusalem. The people, however, were still sacrificing at the high places because a temple had not yet been built for the name of the Lord Yahweh. Solomon showed his love for the Lord Yahweh by walking according to the statutes of his father David, except that he did offer sacrifices and burned incense on the high places. Okay, let's talk a little bit about this. First off, this is an important passage because it gives us a sense of the political power of Solomon and his kingdom. Okay, Egypt was considered the greatest power at this time. And a great power does not make an alliance with a weaker power. What I mean by that is, if you look at this thing, okay, what happens is Solomon makes an alliance with King Pharaoh, and King Pharaoh gives his daughter to Solomon. Now, whenever there's an alliance, usually one party will give a daughter to the other party. This was how kings back then made alliances. Now, this served two purposes. One, it meant that Pharaoh could not break his word to Solomon, because if he did, he would be putting his daughter's life in danger. Okay, so his daughter was kind of like a hostage in that way. A political hostage, that if Pharaoh did something bad, Solomon could kill his Pharaoh's daughter. But it also led to another thing of if Solomon and Pharaoh's daughter had children, that would mean that now King Solomon and Pharaoh were like more directly related. The families were related. Okay, so that's what's happening here. And one other thing we know is that we know at this time, with his daughter, Pharaoh also gave a dowry. And the dowry was the city of Gezer. Okay, so King Solomon was powerful enough that Pharaoh wanted him for a son-in-law. Pharaoh wanted him to be close, wanted to make this treaty with him, gave him his daughter, and also gave him a full city as part of his dowry. Now, what does Solomon do? Solomon brings this lady into the old city, which is called the city of David, right, until he can build his own palace and the temple. Now, the interesting thing is we know from 2 Corinthians that Solomon did not let her stay in the temple of in the house of David, the palace that David lived in, because at one point the Ark of the Covenant had been brought into David's house. And when it was brought into David's house, from that point onwards, King Solomon considered the palace that David lived in to be a holy place. So he did not want Pharaoh's daughter living there because Pharaoh's daughter was not a Jew. So he had her living in a separate place until he could build this palace for her to live in. Okay, continuing on, we see that there was still a problem, though, because the people were sacrificing at high places. Now, this is an interesting thing to realize. High places become an issue for the people of Israel. Okay, first off, a couple of things. At this time, the God they are worshiping at the high place is Yahweh God. Okay, so not worshiping other gods. But Deuteronomy 12 tells them, the people of Israel, that they are not supposed to worship any gods at high places. They're supposed to destroy them because Yahweh God should only be worshipped in the place that he chooses, which should be the tabernacle. Okay, after the tabernacle is wherever the Ark of the Covenant was, and then later it became the temple. Okay, that's where you're supposed to worship God. Any other place is not right. So they're not supposed to worship on these high places. There's a reason for it. Because high places were used to worship any god. What I mean by that is, before the Jews arrived here, all the high places were used to worship the local god of the Canaanites. So when the Jews came in and the Israelites came in and they destroyed all those high places, some of them started to worship Yahweh God at that same place. The problem, right now it's not an issue because everybody's following Yahweh, but later on it becomes a big issue because the people start to worship the other gods that used to be worshipped there. And they stop worshiping Yahweh. So high places are a big issue. And this is why the writer of Kings points out that the people are still worshiping at those high places where they should not be worshiping. Solomon himself also continues to be a good person. He's following in the footsteps of King David. And this is very high praise because to be someone who follows the footsteps of David, David becomes like the standard to how you rate a good king. In fact, by the New Testament time, to be called a son of David is a way of saying this is a good person. This person is an epitome of what a Jew should be like. David was the gold standard. This is how a person should be because he loved God and God loved him. Okay, so let's move on and see what happens in verse 4. The king went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices, for that was the most important high place, and King Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on the altar there. At Gibeon, the Lord Yahweh appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream. The Lord said, "Ask for whatever you want, and I will give it." Solomon answered, "You have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in his heart. You have continued this great kindness to him and was very faithful to you. You have continued this great kindness to him and have given him a son to sit on his throne to this very day. Now, O Lord Yahweh my God, you have made your servant king in place of his father David, but I am only a small child. I do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen. It is a great people, too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern as great a people as yours?" The Lord Yahweh was pleased with what Solomon asked him. So God said to him, Since you have asked for this and not for a long life or wealth for yourself, nor have you asked for the death of your enemies, but instead you asked for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you did not ask for as well. You will have both riches and honors, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among the kings. And if you walk in my ways and obey my statutes and commands, as King David your father did, I will also give you a long life. Then Solomon woke up, and he realized this had all been a dream. He returned to Jerusalem, stood before the ark of the Lord's covenant, and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then he gave a feast for all his court. Okay, so we see that King Solomon went to Gibeon, offer sacrifices, huge amount of sacrifices, 1,000 sacrifices, and Gibeon was a high place. So why was God okay with him going to Gibeon? Well, there's possibly a reason, and one of those reasons is Gibeon was where the tabernacle was. Before, the tabernacle had been at Gibeon, possibly was still there, but it was empty because the ark had been brought into Jerusalem. And Gibeon is quite close to Jerusalem. It's only about 3.5 kilometers, a little more than 2 miles in between the two places. Okay, so it's not a very far walk. And that was where the tabernacle possibly was still standing. Okay, that's where it had been. It probably was still standing there. But the ark itself had been brought into Jerusalem, because David wanted it there. And what's happening is King Solomon has gone to this place where the ark used to be, where the tabernacle was, probably, and is doing all his sacrifices there. So it's not a bad thing he is doing. Now, King Solomon falls asleep, right? God starts talking to him, God promises him anything. Well, King Solomon is very humble in this. He points out how good God has been to his father, how he is just like a servant, and how he's very young. Was quite young. So King Solomon talks about how young he was, and he points out that there's so many people, and I don't know what to do. Now, which is interesting because Solomon is already a powerful king at this time, but he understands that he needs wisdom and guidance because he is not intelligent enough to do this by himself. So he asks God for wisdom. Well, God is very happy with that. Not only gives him the wisdom because he asked for something that was not selfish. And that's the point here, is Solomon's ask is not something selfish. He is asking for wisdom and discernment so he can judge and so he can rule the people well. God is so pleased with that he says, okay, not only will I give you what you asked for, I will give you the things you didn't ask for. Now, you notice there's a little bit something interesting in these. He's going to give him several things. First thing he gives him is you will be wise. You'll be wiser than anyone ever has been or anyone ever will be. So this is a past and a future promise to King Solomon. But notice the next one. You'll be richer than anyone who has been in the past. It doesn't talk about the future. And I think that's kind of interesting because it means that Solomon's wisdom wouldn't be equaled, but his wealth would. And obviously there have been people that have been fabulously wealthy since then. Now the third thing he gives him is a long life, but this is very conditional. Long life is only conditional on King Solomon continuing to follow Yahweh as David did. If he doesn't, well, this particular promise doesn't go into, action. Anyway, after this, Solomon wakes up, he figures out the dream, he realizes that God has come to him in a dream in his sleep, and all of this happens. So what does he do? He returns to Jerusalem and does sacrifices and fellowship offerings before the ark. And so he's honoring both places, the place where the tabernacle was and the place where the ark is now. And then he gives a feast to all his court, probably out of thanks to the great thing that God has done and what God is promising. One more thing before I close up. I just want to mention that Pharaoh's daughter is probably not his first wife. If you look at how old he is and how many years he reigns and how old his son is when his son becomes king, you can see that he was actually married before he became king. But it looks like Pharaoh's daughter might have been his first wife that he collected after becoming king. And I say collected because he is going to acquire many wives over his life. And we will stop here